Welcome to Beyond the Bee, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lyft Economy. My guests today are Charlotte Levitt and Michele Bradley. Charlotte is Global Director of Marketing and Communications for B-Lab. Charlotte has 20 years of experience in external-facing roles across the nonprofit, public, and private sectors. A clear communicator and creative thinker, she has led voter education and engagement for the City of New York and marketing for BAM, an innovative performing arts center in Brooklyn. Before B-Lab, she was Vice President for Strategy and Communications with Citizens Budget Commission, a nonprofit civic organization, a musician with an MBA, which we might have to talk about, like what kind of music you're into. She's an alumna of Columbia Business School, the New England Conservatory, and the Coro Leadership New York. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thanks. And yes, always happy to talk about music. Maybe we just shift the whole focus.
Yeah, for sure. And Michele Bradley is the Data Analytics and Research Manager on the Insights team at B-Lab Global. She holds a bachelor's in statistics and a master's in data science and is passionate about using data to drive informed decisions. With over 6 years of experience at B-Lab, she specializes in leveraging data to drive impact and create positive change. Michele, welcome to you as well.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So maybe let's start with introductions. Charlotte, could you first share a bit about your background beyond maybe what's described in the bio? And you can add in some stuff about music, like what kind of musical instrument and things like that. And then what were you up to before you got into this work with B-Lab?
Yeah, thanks for having us, Ryan. You know, I came to B-Lab feeling like it kind of sat at the intersection of all of the things I had been doing pre-B-Lab, because I really do think of it as being the place where my work in government and the public sector and in nonprofits, and then also my experience as a strategy consultant coming out of business school, like all intersect. And that was kind of what was exciting to me about coming to B-Lab, was the opportunity to sit at that point of interface between all of the experiences that I had had. So I did start life as a classical singer studying opera. My dad is a musician. My mom's an English teacher. And so for me, finding ways that we could communicate about something, including things that can be a little like erudite or abstract or difficult to understand, and turn that into something that could be a story that people could kind of readily grasp, feels like it was built into my DNA from the time I was a child. And it's really what I'm excited about doing at B-Lab too. And I think that my last stop before transfer into the sustainability space was working in government. And so specifically for the city of New York, they were introducing ranked choice voting, which is a new way to elect candidates for local office, specifically in primaries. And people were really worried it was like too confusing and no one would be able to do it. There were a lot of naysayers and that it was too technical. And that was kind of the big thing I did right before B-Lab, was figure out how can we talk about this topic in a way that empowers people to participate in local government that doesn't feel overwhelming. Because the truth is, like, we do all know how to make choices and how to say, well, my first choice is this, but if I can't have that, my second choice is that. And so I do believe the through line has been, I think people have a lot of power and agency and are capable of a lot, sometimes more than we give them credit for. And if we can find a way to talk about things that are complicated, which sustainability is, in a way that is accessible to those people, we empower just a more engaged and connected life for our communities. So that's what brought me to B-Lab.
Awesome. And one more quick follow-up was the citizens budget work, was that around like citizens designing their own budget, or was that more around the ranked choice?
Sort of. So Citizens Budget Commission is like a civic research and policy organization that's existed in New York City for a long time, one of like a litany of organizations that existed to be sort of checks and challenges to the government on making sure that the process was actually open and transparent to citizens. And so CBC particularly focuses on finances as this unlock for people to have power in the political system if they understand how money is actually being used. I wasn't particularly working on what you're thinking of, which is participatory budgeting in that organization, though I did work a little bit on that when I was in New York City government, which we do have a participatory budgeting process where local communities can come up with projects that they'd like to see in their neighborhood and vote. And that kind of engagement is actually powered by a B Corp that is headquartered in Europe, among other vendors. But there's a B Corp called Go Vocal that actually runs those kinds of participatory budgeting platforms. So
awesome.
Adjacent.
Awesome. And Michele, you're kind of deep in data. And so how did your upbringing get you so interested in data, like pre-B Lab? What were you sort of up to?
I think I always just loved playing with data, even though that sounds really nerdy or potentially odd, but I always felt there was a lot of power in numbers and that it was this untapped resource of things that we already were collecting a lot of, but maybe we didn't exactly know what was there. I think I first initially got interested in data stuff was probably in high school, working on a research project and just had lots of survey data, which is actually quite similar to what we're discussing later, but always just found it really fascinating. And so in undergrad, studied statistics, and particularly at a business school, which I think also is what led me to B Lab, is that there was a lot of conversations around business practices and what is a normal business do. And we focused a lot on case studies around how can businesses be more efficient or how can they make more money, especially how can we make more money. And I think I was also coming at it from a place of being very environmentally minded and cared a lot about social issues. And so anytime I would hear these types of case studies, I just sort of felt like there was something else there. There was a different lens that we could be approaching just using business as a force for good, and learned about B Corps and B Lab through really undergrad and business school, and hearing what businesses were doing and seeing that there must have been another way.
So yeah, I think just to frame up the conversation for folks who are listening, we're here with Charlotte and Michele to discuss B Lab released in, I think, October of 2024, a report, part of an insight series called B Corp Brand Awareness. And it's the first time that there's been sort of a collective, global brand awareness survey. And Charlotte, I'm wondering if you could speak to what was sort of the lead up to this and what motivated B Lab to first say okay, we need to not just say a US specific or Europe or whatever. How do we get a global brand awareness survey?
Yes. So for those in the know about B Lab's structure, it's the brand awareness survey is kind of a mirror of the entire reality of how we work together. So we had been administering brand awareness surveys sort of market by market for a while. And the number of regions that were interested in understanding this was increasing. We, at that point, the team, before I got here, put together some guidelines and said, this is awesome, but can we try to ask some of the same questions so that we can actually have data across multiple regions? So that groundwork had been laid, but much like B Lab itself, the truth is that this report is a synthesis of what is actually sort of a chorus of different voices from around the network. And so each market administered their study. And the thing that was really the innovation was Michele and the insights team pulling it together into a single analysis, which those who know data know that your ability to do that is only as good as the source you've got to work from. And so that was important. But I think that the ability to look across markets at a point in time and say, what can we learn by comparing these markets to each other was a really unique thing that we hadn't been able to do until this moment.
Awesome. And yeah, Michele, could you speak to the methodology and approach, and how did you think through this project from your end?
So as Charlotte mentioned, we did have a guideline book for all of the regions to say, let's all ask the exact same question, the exact same way, so we can actually see how brand awareness is shaping up across our different areas. And so we had 4 global partner regions conduct this study. It was B Lab UK, B Lab US and Canada, B Lab Europe, and B Lab Australia, New Zealand. And the goal there was, and we achieved this, that each region collected data from at least 1,000 customers in each of the countries that they represented. So we had 14 countries in total. So we wanted to try and have a diverse and representative sample.
So there were some areas left out. And so maybe you could speak to Asia, Latin America, and maybe the reasons those regions didn't participate in Africa as well. And then I think this survey is more an initial look at some of the trends rather than like a definitive, like this is exactly what's happening. And so maybe you could speak to those things as well.
Yeah, that is the biggest limitation, that we haven't been able to really get a global perspective here because we are missing out on some of our newer regions, Asia and Africa, and some of our biggest regions, which is Sistema Bay in Latin America. So that is definitely the biggest limitation. Remember, we're talking about this data, but I think still really helpful perspective in what we do have here, which is a first of its kind, being able to understand what is the collective analysis and what does brand awareness look like in the regions that we do have.
Is the reason that it's only those regions and not the others, is it just like it was just hard to like herd all the cats to like get everyone to fill out the data, or translation for the surveys, or what would you say?
The short answer is like, it was not a grand plan. It was merely what happened.
Yes.
We would love to have data for every single region where we operate in our current structure, where each region is kind of empowered to do their own thing. But commensurately, also, we don't have as many pooled resources. Like, it's a limitation of that structure. And I think we'd all love to have data for more regions around the world.
So why don't we jump in for folks who are maybe just reading this or being reminded of like, oh yeah, there was this report. Often I ask myself this question when I'm thinking about providing value. People is like, so what? So like I'm a B Corp, or I'm an aspiring B Corp. There's this report, like what's in it for me? And what do you think the top 2 to 3 findings or insights, or like, what do you think listeners should really take away from this that could benefit them?
I think there are 3, because we haven't talked about the content of the report. So I think we need to start with what did we learn? And I can throw in some, how would I use it? Because I've had these conversations with B Corps. So the first insight I think is really interesting and probably won't be that surprising, is that younger audiences are more aware of B Corp certification. So it kind of spike differs depending on country, but basically people who are under 40 are more likely to know the B Corp brand. For example, in the US, half of consumers under 25 are aware of B Corps. And the so what behind that is that we expect they carry that awareness with them. And we'd like to see that trend continue. And so what that means is that there's a really good reason to believe that if you're thinking about, should I invest in being a B Corp? What's that going to mean in 10 years? The data kind of gives you a pretty good indication that probably it will be more valuable in the future than it is today as this generation continues to come into their own. I think most people who work in that space would find that intuitive. When I talk to people, they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's similar to other data we're seeing. The other thing that is useful to know is that a growing community kind of lifts all B Corps. So I think we'll talk about this more, but basically the more B Corps there are in a market, the higher the brand recognition. Also not shocking, but we can actually prove it because we have enough sort of observations from all the different countries in this study to see it. And there are different points of maturity, different community size. And so we can look at them in a snapshot, point in time, same time, and say, this is actually true, that the bigger the community, the better the awareness. What's kind of interesting about that is that it isn't just the number of really big companies that are certified. It's actually, I think, about the heterogeneity of the community is a really powerful and valuable thing. And to me, if I'm a B Corp, it's really interesting because it means that no matter what size I am better off if more people are in the community with me. And that holds true. Even if you're a large company, seeing a lot of small companies in the movement is actually fantastic for you. If you're a small company, it's also true that having more companies of all sizes is positive for you and the value of your B Corp certification. So I think those are 2 really important insights that have like a direct value to me as a B Corp. We also looked at like the sources of brand awareness, like where it came from. And I think we'll get more into that. But to me, the bottom line on that is like every single time that someone comes into contact with information about certification, it helps. Like more is more on that front. And so if you're also thinking about, well, I would like people in my country to recognize the B Corp brand more, than thinking about, are there other touch points where you might be able to use it? If you're using it one place, are there others you might incorporate it? We do find like this is a kind of commonly known thing in marketing and advertising, but there's something about the number of times someone comes into contact with something, the more likely they are to recognize it.
One thing that stands out to me too is people often ask me, how do I get more out of B Corp certification? Or they might say, I wish I got more from B Corp certification. And I often ask them, well, what are you doing with it? And often it's like, nothing really. I'm like, well, that's why you're not getting anything from it. If I can't tell you how many companies I've helped certify that actually don't have the logo or like don't have an About Us page that talks about why they're a B Corp, or they don't put it on like business cards, or they don't put it in their product or packaging. So I feel like one takeaway from all this for me is also, if I'm a B Corp, is you actually have to lean in and like put in effort to support the community, which also supports your brand. Because I feel like the companies that say, I'm a B Corp, but I haven't found any benefits, it's often because they're not doing anything with it. They're expecting B Lab and others to sort of like raise their brand. That's just one other thing I would say as like an insight that the B Corps could take away from this. Let's talk about this idea of the sheer number of companies is like the best predictor of awareness. I mean, Michele, is there a certain market? I'm obviously thinking UK, like London is like 1,000 B Corps or something like that. What other insights can you provide on like this like sheer number versus say like large companies, or like the density of B Corps or things like that?
Yeah, I thought one of the most interesting findings that we had was that it was not necessarily the largest companies or the presence of large companies in a country that was correlated to brand awareness, but it was truly just the sheer number of B Corps, but also the age of the community. So we looked at the time of the first certification in that country and the brand awareness numbers that we had, and we found that there was also correlation there. And so it's an interesting analysis that it is about volume. It is about seeing the logo. It's about hearing it in your community. It's about finding other businesses in your industry that are also B Corps and you feel inspired. Just in general, the more touch points that people have and the more that they see our content, the more that they can get involved in our movement, the more it grows, the more it becomes mainstream, the more we can better understand B Corps. And it is not just the big companies out there that are doing it. And I think what's also really inspiring about that is about 75% of B Corps are small to medium-sized enterprises. And so it is really a bit of a numbers game in some respect, but all of these companies do have a lot of power in exposing others to the movement and to the mission, and that collectively we are building this together.
Yeah, Charlotte, I think one thing that I've thought about, this finding turns on my head a little bit what I thought it was, because we often look at, or for me, I often look at like, it's Patagonia, it's Ben and Jerry's, it's like these big brands that are really driving the growth and awareness, but that's not what you found. Was that surprising for you at all, or what's your take on that?
It's the difference between anecdotes and data, right? And this is like what's powerful about having data. I mean, in a way, the entire movement is built on the power of having data to help us change our perceptions about things. And so I love it when I see data that changes my conventional wisdom about what I thought was going on. And it's certainly true. Like when I go around and talk to folks, I think that it is important. Stories are really important and salient and sticky. And so it's natural for humans to think about examples as the way that they remember something. But we're also influenced by sort of the prevalence. And to me, it goes to like the core theory of like, why does this movement exist? Part of what we all think is that in order to make it normal to run a business differently, you also need it to be common. So I think that it speaks to the power of that. And so when sometimes we get uncomfortable with the fact that like, hey, this is going from being really small to being a little bit bigger as a movement, it can be helpful to remember that actually that is how we make change.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say on this is that density question of like, let's say there's only 100,000 people in a country. I mean, that's a very small country, but if there's like 1,000 B Corps, it's not necessarily that it's based on the size. Like, I think, I don't want to pick on Denmark, but only 2 out of It looks like a very small percentage, Denmark. Come on, let's pick it up here.
I actually went to Copenhagen shortly after we released this study and talked to B Corps there. So I can offer more. And Michelle's about to be there with our team too, actually. So sorry to interrupt you, but we can talk more.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, like Michelle, it looks like Germany. I mean, I'm just calling out countries and picking on them. I'm sorry, Germany and Denmark. But yeah, is there any insight as to like why those countries might be lower than others, or is that part of the analysis you did?
Actually, interesting analysis done by BLab Europe. So they actually did a new version. This brand awareness research that we're focusing on is on 2023. They just recently released their version for 2024. But there are some interesting highlights there that I think might be worth going into. And so they actually found a 9% jump in recognition across the region in Europe in 1 year. And there were 3 countries in particular where there was pretty big growth between like 11 and 14%. And one of them is Denmark. So we're not going to pick on Denmark.
All right, Denmark. Woo woo.
We're going to shine light on Denmark because they actually had really big growth. And one of the assumptions that we have, or the reasons why, is because there was actually just maybe systemic awareness of improvement of sustainability practices. We asked companies if they recognize a bunch of different logos, not just our own. And they found that year over year recognition for all of them increased. So the thinking there is that perhaps there was a systemic awareness and improvement in Denmark. In Ireland, it actually, I love this example too, because it highlights exactly what we were just saying. There was a really strong growth of community size in Ireland. I think it exemplifies perfectly that the more B Corps that there are, the more awareness that we have. That is just sort of how this mission has been working. The more eyes on it, the more it grows. And then the last country was Spain, and they did a particular marketing campaign there, and they found that there was pretty high correlation with people who had seen that marketing campaign and had growth. So really interesting new research coming in, or new results coming in from the European context, that there are lots of ways for brand awareness to grow. And I love seeing where the correlations are, and, we'll change the data so we look at it per capita, try to understand, remove the large B Corps and whatnot. But there's a lot of ways to sort of understand this data, but there are various ways that brand awareness is just growing.
Can we speak about the UK for a little bit? So I had Chris Turner and Deanne Heward-Mills on talking about the UK, and 1,000 B Corps in London, 2,400 or something. It's like more than the US now. And I was really trying to get to, I don't think I still haven't, like, it's still not clear why it's been growing so much. But I don't know, Charlotte, what's your like latest theory on like B-Lab UK and like the growth in the UK market?
Yeah, happy to opine on this. This is not data.
Okay.
This is opinion.
Charlotte's opinion.
Right? That's the challenge of data. Like, we're good with retrospective. We're not so good with what's happening while it is happening when it comes to numbers. So I can share some kind of qualitative observations about what's happening there. I promise this is not pandering. They have a great team, right? Who's like really engaged and really out there. That makes sense. So we're out there talking to folks, and that like makes a lot of difference. In specific, not just folks who are already B Corps. So there's like a great policy campaign there called the Better Business Act that's acting sort of as, in marketing, we talk about this idea of a funnel. How do you bring people in who aren't yet really aware of what you're doing? I think that to some extent, that advocacy campaign has actually become an amazing way to grow awareness of the movement by bringing people into an advocacy effort where they learn more then about what would it take to maybe join the community. So I think it's an interesting case study in how can you create different kinds of pathways into the community at scale. I do think that the market structure in the UK is a little unique in the sense that there is one very large city with a lot of density of B Corps. And so if you believe that this idea that the more you see it, the more you know it, you could expect that market structure might give them like a little bit of an edge compared to a country that has a lot of cities. So I think that's beneficial for them. But I also think they're doing a great job and have like a super engaged community that's out there doing all the things we were talking about, like putting the brand out there. If you walk around London, you will see the B Corp logo, like frequently. And so I think it can be an inspiration to all of us about how might we learn from markets that are really succeeding and creating value for their whole community at the same time.
My theory is it's also their B Leaders program and like just how amazing that program has been. But that's probably a whole nother side topic. Let's talk about this. Where have you heard of B Corps? Like the sources of awareness. It's pretty interesting. Maybe not surprising that on a product is the top one. But so like on product, and then second is on social media. Third is on a company website or blog. Fourth is an advertisement. Fifth is in a shop or digital. And interestingly, I work for a certified B Corp is pretty low, and at an event is pretty low, and word of mouth I thought would be higher. But yeah, anything else that stands out to you, either Michele or Charlotte, from this, like where the sources of awareness are?
I'll do one from my stance as like a marketing practitioner, and I'd love to hear Michelle's from where she sits. I am very surprised that word of mouth is as low as it is. It is very unusual for studies like this. So I find that quite interesting. It does absolutely testify to like the importance of being able to use the B Corp certification on product, on digital channels, and all those kinds of places. But I think it's an interesting question how we could seed more conversation. I wonder when I see that data, if it has anything to do with data you'll sometimes see about, for example, people's proclivity to like talk about climate change with their friends. Talking about these topics for some people can feel difficult. And I wonder if that's part of what's going on there. But having worked in other industries and done studies like this, it's very unusual.
Michele, what's your take on the sources of awareness data? Or maybe in particular, does anything stand out to you as like, oh, I thought maybe word of mouth or in an advertisement is interesting? I didn't think that would be very high, but yeah, I'm curious. What about you, Michele?
Yeah, I mean, I did think that a product would be the highest. Like, I think that when we have a lot of resources to encourage companies to put it on their packaging, there's a lot of pathways for them to do that. I think I was pleasantly surprised, though, on that social media and on their website was so high, too. Like, this is also a movement, and putting it on those platforms, I think it gives more space for them to talk about what it means. When you see it on a product, you have to do a little bit more research. But when you have a social media post or you have a blog, you can actually explain what that is. So I think it might have a little bit more of a lasting impact. This is also the issue with data, is that I'm sure more people have seen a B Corp logo on a product than 42% of people. They're everywhere. As Charlotte mentioned, you walk around the streets of certain cities and you can see it everywhere. Same in New York where I am, I can see it often. But maybe you may not recognize it or remember it in the same way as maybe opening up social media and seeing a really big post about it, or going on a blog post and actually understanding what B Corps mean. And I think that's the other aspect of this, that the research that we found also highlighted that while people may have heard of it, there is a lot of work to do in actually understanding what does a B Corp mean. It's a very nuanced thing. There's social impacts, there's environmental impacts, and some people, I think there's higher recognition of social issues, but not necessarily on the social ones. And so it is a complicated certification, but yeah, being able to explain it really helps.
Yeah, I think in the US, in the report, there was something around 85%, or it's like if you're already familiar, it affected your purchasing decision like 85% of the time or something. Am I saying that one correctly?
Yeah, I think that was actually some third-party data that we got and pulled in. So it wasn't even us asking that question. But yeah, this question of the overlap between awareness and then what do people do? How does it impact their behavior is an interesting one that I think we were really focused on recognition and comprehension, but it's always cool to see examples of people who have data about what action do people take. Often we don't have as much visibility into that, right? We don't have as much data as B Corps themselves hold on how it impacts people's behavior.
Charlotte, could you also speak to the logo recognition versus general brand awareness and like the sort of differences there? Like, does general brand awareness just mean like, have you heard of something called a B Corp? Is that the question?
Yes, where total aggregate awareness is usually like the sum, but non-duplicative of have you heard of it and do you recognize it? If I could, I'd love to like zoom out for a second and just talk about brand awareness and what the hell it is and what it means and how it's built. Because there's a great designer, his name's Michael Beirut. He's done a lot of like really famous logos. And he has this metaphor that I find really helpful in thinking about this. It ties to some things we've already talked about. He says that often people think that a brand, especially when you like launch a new logo, for example, right? He says people think it's a diving contest. They think it's about like, how beautifully did you enter the water at that one moment in time? And how great is it? And how perfect is it? And he says that actually that's the wrong way to think about it. It's a swimming competition. It's about the consistency with which you take stroke after stroke and actually build something over time. And I think it's a useful metaphor. And I would even extend it. When it comes to the B Corp community, we are engaged in like a relay race. So we're all swimming together and we are all like stroke over stroke building this together. And that is so unique. I have never worked in an organization where that was true. And it is a tremendous opportunity for this community to be part of the relay race. And it's also an environment in which we have to think really differently about how we can be enablers of the relay team because we're not doing it ourselves. And so I think that that helps us think about what is the brand awareness that we're trying to build and how does it happen? He says that basically what you're doing is you're over time, every interaction that someone has that is connected to this brand cumulatively all together, it builds up to your sense of what is this? What does it mean? It's just a symbol into which we pour a bunch of associations. And for us, it's a symbol that is actually incredibly simple. It's a bee in a circle. And what that means, defining that for people, that's the task in which we're engaged. And so what does it suggest? That people are more likely to recognize the combination of both the name and the logo, or they kind of know the bee? It just suggests that like people encounter it in a variety of ways. And it's kind of like the sum of all of that adds up to what the brand is.
Yeah. And it reminds me of, there's different data for different types of mediums in which someone encounters something. But if it's like social media, you have to see it like 1,000 times for it to register, or like a billboard, you see like 27 billboards and then you're like, oh, wait, I've seen that before. So I do feel like the collective spread of B Corp does allow people to like have those moments of like impressions across different products and platforms. So yeah, I mean, I do think moving to this next set of questions around like any surprises or maybe like, I wish it would have shown this. I mean, I think there is a perennial challenge for us in the B Corp world, to be honest, around just like, it's not so easy to say B Corp equals X amount of revenue increase, or like, if you become a B Corp, you will hire 100% of the best talent. We can't really make those associations. And I think it would be unfair of this to like ask this brand report or us to like do that. But I do think it is sort of the forbidden, the secret thing that we're all chasing, right? Is like to make that value proposition super clear. I don't know, Charlotte, do you have any thoughts on like what we have to work with in terms of the data versus the gap of like what we'd love to have is like this clear, super amazing value proposition?
Fair enough. I will say that the community understands that there are ways and opportunities and moments where you can say, this action is related to this factor. And there are others where you do something because it's what you've committed to as a company. And so I think that it's important to be real about that. When I used to work in voting, we would talk sometimes about like, what are the most effective messages for getting people to vote? And one of the messages that people love to use a lot is that it's the sense that your vote matters. Your vote will change the outcome of the election. That's very rarely true. It's almost never the case. And I always kind of preferred a message of you vote because you want to be the kind of person who votes. And you do it as an act of like hope and belief in the world in which you want to participate. And I kind of feel that way about B Corp certification. Probably your listeners, and because I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, might identify with the sense that I do think there is clearly a value proposition for B Corp certification. And I also think that to some extent, to stay the course, having a commitment to the fact that this is core to our business feels pretty important. But I can share, an example that is in the report, which is we got some interesting data because often we don't have access to this kind of stuff about an activation that Unilever did in New Zealand, which was kind of like a perfect little test case because New Zealand's a pretty isolated market. You can kind of flood the zone pretty easily. So when they did this kind of activation in a big grocery store there called Foodstuffs, they did a lot of coordinated activity that they could do because it was a small market where they could have a lot of control. And so it wasn't just the portfolio of products that had the logo on pack, which we just talked about. It's also kind of signage in the aisle and QR codes to learn more about it means, and like this 360 sort of activation, advertising, all the things. They reached a bunch of new shoppers. 45% of the 890,000 people who saw the campaign were new to the brand, and they ended up driving a lot of incremental sales lift. In one particular product, it was 7%, which if you work in CPG is pretty big. It also drove a lot of traffic to the website, people wanting to learn more about what the hell this thing meant. And we have also that third-party data you mentioned before. This is a slightly different cut, but basically of grocery shoppers that they talked to, 46% of them said they'd actually purchased a product because they saw the logo. So I think that we can say that it can drive value. And also, I go back to that, like some of it is that, some of it's value, and some of it is values.
Absolutely. And, this is going a little bit off topic, but I just feel like one of the amazing things B Lab has done, but also created a challenge for itself, is like B Lab, in addition to the B Corps, has like created this movement. And the challenge with this movement is that everyone sort of can like put their own hopes and dreams and aspirations about like what it should mean or like what it is to them or like what it should be to everybody. And so in a way, it's like great because we are like motivated to like all put in our collective efforts to like make some change in the world. And then B Lab, as like a pretty small, not super abundantly resourced organization, has to then like deal with everyone's sort of like beliefs and like dreams and hopes and aspirations and like thoughts and advice on like what it should do. So I'm just noting, I don't even know if this is really like a question I'm asking, but I'm like seeing that this, and with this brand report, that it sort of reflects all these disparate groups we've brought together in this movement and just how hard it is to really like get everyone moving in one direction and sort of like build momentum and like what works or what doesn't. So anyways, that was just like, I'm happy to, I don't know if any of you have any thoughts. Yes.
And
if you have any thoughts on that.
I have been shocked. I don't know about you, Michelle. I have been shocked going to different continents, different languages, different cultures, how consistent I feel actually the way that people talk about the movement is across borders. Michelle, I don't know like what experience you've had with this. You've actually been at B Lab longer than me, but I've always found it actually quite remarkable. We don't use the exact same words, both literally in terms of the language, the dialect we speak, but also, like I said, it's this like relay race kind of brand. And so we're constantly passing the baton and people are explaining things in slightly different ways. I find it to be pretty harmonious overall. Like it adds up to something. And like most people who study brands would say that really the brand is what other people believe. It's not what you want to say. And I've actually been quite surprised by how compatible it feels actually as I travel to different places.
Michelle, have you experienced that as well in your time at B Lab? Do they let you go to conferences though if you're on the data and analytics team, or do you have to just like stay in the office like in a dark room with a computer like analyzing data?
Most of my day is behind a computer tapping a database and just trying to see what I can find about B Corps. I have gone to some more of the academic. So like whenever there's like a B Champions Retreat in the US, I've gone to like the B Academics one. And I think that one for sure, there is this amazing group across the entire world, really every continent. There's a couple of researchers who are really interested and passionate about our data and what we can say about B Corps and researching B Corps, sort of trying to understand what that mission that we have is and what we're actually impacting. It's a lot there.
Yeah, and maybe I'm sort of like having processed my own comments earlier. I think what I'm more saying is the challenge of just so many different opinions about like what B Lab should do or what the movement should do. So for example, B Lab should not let Unilever Australia, New Zealand in. Like they should not be part of the community. There's that opinion. Or there's like, we have to let large companies in or we won't have enough impact because we're such a small community. Or B Lab should include like a living wage, or B Lab should not include a living wage in like the new standards or like, so it's just, there's like so many different strong beliefs that are placed upon B Lab, I guess. And just sort of, that's just a lot to deal with. And like you said, the yes and part is if, for example, if I go to Chile and meet a fellow B Corp, it's like I'm already friends with them. Like, dude, you're a B Corp. That's great. So there's that connection that's like, in spite of all the differing, strongly held differing opinions about like what should happen or not, there is consistency amongst some of the key things. So I guess you've helped me realize what I was saying, Charlotte. So thank you.
I also do feel like it is the shared language. Like thinking back to business school, for example, I didn't have the words of like using business as a force for good, but that is something that we share a lot. And just us all having that same shared language around what it means to be a good business. And this is the framework in which we're looking. That's, it's universal. And that's also what makes our data and our movement really challenging, is that we try to bring in so many different companies, like various industries, various countries. This is what makes our job somewhat complicated, but we do try and have that shared language.
Charlotte, in terms of B Lab, the sort of even better if, like, what do you think B Lab could do better at when it comes to clarifying or deepening public understanding of what B Corp certification really means?
I do think what you're saying points a little in a direction that we will be moving as we have new standards, to be able to really come together globally to state with clarity what it does mean to be a B Corp. And I think that the new standards will give us a better platform to be able to have confidence in what it means for every single company that's in the community. I think that is a challenge. And I think your comment is kind of like about that. I also think we will continue to be, and maybe I'm comfortable with it, having come from a political background, like we're a coalition of willing businesses who want to be better. It's never going to be the case that everyone has the same opinion on everything. But what I think we can do is get a little bit clearer on what every B Corp has in common. And I think the standards will enable that. And I think that there's opportunities for us to work together more globally as a movement and as an organization, to have times where we're coming together and saying things with one voice. So right now, like B Corp month is kind of the moment when we do that globally once a year. That's cool. It would be interesting to think like, are there other moments that we can do that we can build on these new standards to be able to have a few more moments of alignment? Not that everyone's going to do the same thing all the time in every market, but I think that if we could do that, it could be powerful for people.
One thing that stood out to me was the public perception of B Corps mainly being like environmental and like not really looking at the social side. I mean, it also relates to one of the findings in the study around the human rights component of the ESG scores of like a country had like a strong correlation with brand awareness. So it, like, I guess if you're not necessarily as familiar with this data, you might think, hey, if I really focus on like an environmental message, they'll just be like more B Corps, or like it will sort of have more of an impact. But actually, there is a public perception of like environment, but there's actually like a stronger correlation with the human rights component and the social side. Could you speak to that? I'm not sure, Michele or Charlotte.
Maybe Michele, you want to start with kind of just what is the data we're talking about? Ryan, I'm impressed. You like clicked on every single chart in this entire report, obviously. You're now like throwing off all our data in the background. We're going to be like, why is engagement with this report so high in April 2024?
There's just one user.
But Michele, you want to talk a little about the data itself, and then I'm happy to come in.
What we were trying to do is we collect so much ourselves, a lot of impact data, and the desire is to understand that in a more global context. So we found this 2023 ESG index from the Global Risk Profile, where they looked at human rights score, environment score, and ESG scores for different countries. And we were just curious, how does that relate to brand awareness? How does the country's performance of those various metrics relate to brand awareness? And we found that human rights was the most correlated there.
Yeah, that's fascinating because, again, I would just assume it would be like environmental performance would correlate the highest. But Charlotte, what's your sort of insights on this one?
Yeah, what the hell does that mean? I mean, we know, and it seems to be fairly consistent across most of the studies I've looked at, that people's first thought about what B Corp certification means is environmental. It's possible that has a little to do, like my intuition is it has a little to do with what you're talking about before, which is like, what are the most famous B Corps that people have heard of? And what are their associations with those B Corps? It's kind of like this associations transfer to each other. And so if the B Corps I've heard of, what I know about them is that they have strong environmental practices, then I might subconsciously draw that kind of association. I think that often social practices are harder for people to understand and quantify. My intuition, maybe, about what's going on with this data is that markets where people have a sophisticated enough understanding of human rights to identify that as an issue are perhaps markets with like a more mature understanding of sustainability being broader than just, for example, waste, which might be like people's first entry point into what is sustainability. Oh, it's maybe something about packaging. So I think there could be something that's sort of like a maturity journey for consumers of what they understand to be kind of material here. I know that like that was true of like my own journey as like a citizen and how I kind of became turned on to this world. So anecdata, but that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, and as the human rights score for the US probably plummets this year, maybe the data change. That's a whole nother topic. I think this is going back to the B Corp Month comment. You've been leading on this for a while, Charlotte, and I don't know if that many B Corps are even, I'll speak for myself. I don't actually know how big of a bump the B Corp community is getting from B Corp Month, and is that like sustainable? Is it just a blip and then it goes away? Or like, what is the value that you've seen from your end on like B Corp Month and driving awareness of B Corps?
So first of all, open invitation. If you have data on how B Corp Month helped your business, please reach out to me. Because often we have a gap. Like there are certain things we can observe, but we don't necessarily get to observe the impact on all of your businesses. And so if people want to share some of that info and be our next case study, feel free to reach out to me.
What's your email?
Yeah. You can put in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll put in the show notes.
I'm on Beehive. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm around. I'm findable. So what we know about B Corp Month, it drives tons of impressions, right? So that's the number of times, going back to this thing of the number of times you see it. So we know that there's a huge spike in the amount of conversation happening on social media during B Corp Month. We see spikes in the amount of inbound traffic to our own website. We also have a bcorpmonth.com website where people can visit and find events that are happening and all that kind of stuff. If you visit it now, it'll look a little sad because there's no upcoming events because it's over. But, so we can observe those things. And we do. We can see spikes in mentions in the press. We can see spikes in conversation on social media. We typically get tens of millions of free impressions that are happening during that month. We have practically no advertising budget ourselves. And so going back to the relay race, it's like we host a big swim meet and everyone shows up and swims. And so that's great for us. That's part of why I think about like, what are the additional moments we might find where we could catalyze that kind of impact collectively together at the same time? Because it really is just sort of about deciding we're going to all do the same thing at the same time. That's where a lot of the value comes from. But what I don't know, and your listeners may know, is what does it mean for your company? And I'd love to hear stories about that.
You almost need a spring and a fall B Corp month. Be like, September's B Corp month too, isn't it?
I don't think we're going to do B Corp month too.
Yeah.
But I think there are other things we could do. So leave it there.
For sure. Another story that stood out from this report was the one with Earth Animal, where they engaged I guess they got a bunch of interns that they had worked with and said, hey, we need to connect with young people. Can you do a presentation? Ask their interns and do a presentation about what's meaningful to them, I think. And what stood out was like sustainability and impact. I'd love to learn more about this story if either of you have more on like the background of that story.
I'm pretty sure that I met Stephanie through Beehive. So plug to pay attention when I post things on Beehive. I'm pretty sure I went on the Beehive and just said, hey, we're seeing this interesting thing in the data, which is that younger people seem to be more aware of B Corp certification. Like, who has stories about this? Because like we talked about, like the numbers show us what's true, but the stories help us remember it. So I'm pretty sure that's how we met and we chatted about it. And I thought it was such a great case study of like listening to the people who are already showing you that they're interested in what you're doing. And so she chatted with me about this kind of committee of interns who got to present to senior leadership at the company about how they could change the way they were talking about their B Corp certification. I thought that was really cool. I mean, we also talked to some other folks who have a lot of younger customers. We talked to the head of marketing at Everyman Jack, and they had a hilarious TikTok that is embedded in the report that you can go watch that is a now very old TikTok trend, but at the time was fun. And then finally, we talked to the founder of Ecolytics, who herself is in Gen Z. And so she talked to us and kind of reinforced what they heard from the interns. So that's how that all came together. So yeah, watch Beehive. You could be in our next report.
I also loved the idea of asking your interns to like actually tell you what's cool or what's trending or what like how they're getting information. Because I feel like I'm like early millennial, like born in 83. And I feel like I still have some grasp of like what younger people, but it's like I probably am missing so much about what is actually happening and what folks are communicating. And so I just thought that was a brilliant idea to have a brand be like engaging with their own young folks to sort of tell them what they should be doing. There was something that you talked about in the report around like the broader systems change conversation and like using brand not just as a market signal, but like a broader asset for systems change. So this kind of goes to that theory of change for B Lab. Yeah, can you speak about what is the connection between the like brand as an asset for systems change, just so folks can think about that?
Yeah, I'll say a little about my thoughts, and I'd love to hear Michelle's too. So I come to this work having worked in government and specifically on voter engagement. And I always find it interesting that in different sectors, we talk about humans using different words. So we call them consumers. When I was in voting, we called them citizens, which is a word that can also, in the United States context, sometimes be freighted with some baggage. But we're people, right? So like we bring whatever we know with us, no matter what function we're serving at that moment in time. And so you talked about how some people heard about B Corp because they worked at a B Corp. And then when they went on and worked somewhere else, they brought that knowledge with them to that new employer. Same thing is true. I am at the grocery store deciding what baby food to buy, but the next day I might be voting for my new mayoral candidate in New York City. We're very excited for our mayoral primary coming up. So I think about it that way as just like, sometimes we try to put people in different boxes, but the reality is that they play all of those roles in their lives. And so if they gain this awareness in one particular role, they bring it into the other roles. And if our ultimate goal is actually to change the entire system, we need people to be acting in accordance with the kind of behavior we'd like to encourage in all of those roles, as workers, as consumers, as voters. And so that's how I think it's like an asset, because they're the same people. They're just playing different functions. And so it helps us to be able to mobilize across all the different ways that we have power through our choices to be able to make change. Individually, it's always going to be small, but I think that when we bring it with us into different contexts in coalition with other people, we can do a lot. Michele, what do you think? You're a voter and a citizen and a consumer.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to use some data from other things that I thought were interesting when we're delving into this sort of brand awareness info. One, this was not our finding, but I think exemplifies what we're trying to say is 83% of millennials engage in value-based shopping is what we found. In the EU, we found that 87% believe it should be mandatory for businesses to consider the interest of all stakeholders. In the UK, they, after wrapping up their brand awareness survey, they found that 61% were interested in purchasing from a B Corp. I think once more people understand what the system level type of change we're trying to do, the theory of change that we're aiming for here, the more people want to engage with it. And so really just B Corps are not just a logo, it is like an asset, like for systems change.
Yeah, totally agree. Michele, maybe looking forward, are there research projects or initiatives that you're going to be delving into from the B Lab Insights team that you're open to speaking about?
Yeah, we have a lot. We're always delving into the data that we have. A prior report that we did was on financial resilience of B Corps, which I thought was really interesting. We looked at B Corps pre and post COVID to see what was the resilience of the B Corp, and we found that a lot of B Corps were more resilient than their ordinary business peers. We're working on another project on employee practices at B Corps and seeing how job quality is impacted by different measures and different things that a B Corp will do or any company will do. And another project that we're really excited for is that we started our second year of our fellowship program, which is one pathway where we try to bring in the B Corp community and researchers to use and leverage our data, because we have 300,000 companies that have used our tools. There's so many different questions that we have data for. And so we sit on so much and we don't nearly have as much time to do the research on it. And so we have 4 amazing fellows this year who are going to be working and delving into our data. One's on innovation, one is looking at the satisfaction of employees. And so there's a lot of potential here for the data that we have.
And these are like college students?
No, they're PhD
wow.
students. Yeah, they have advisors.
So this isn't some interns in a summer vacation.
No. They are like, some of them are defending their PhDs and using our data for it. So it is really high quality work that they've been doing, and academic timelines are long. So we're excited to see some of the research get published.
Yay. Okay. So Charlotte, if we returned to this conversation in 5 years, what would success look like for B Lab's brand or the B Corp community's brand awareness efforts and the community's role in supporting that growth?
We live in such interesting times that, it feels like to answer that question, you have to start by thinking about what's going to be true in the world in 5 years. And I think that we know that there's a lot going on out there that can feel like headwinds to people doing this work right now.
I think headwinds might be an understatement.
An understatement. What would we call it?
Hurricane gale force.
Gale force.
Headwinds.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Whatever. It's intense. I'm an optimist.
Fair enough.
By nature. But I also truly believe that in 5 years, there are going to be more companies doing this work, because we must for the planet. We know that the next generation of leaders, workers, consumers, voters, et cetera, is going to demand it. We know that despite the significant political bluster that's happening, there are many places in the world that are going to continue to require more of companies who want to operate in their markets. This is especially true in Europe. And this is true even with the changes that are happening right now. To me, there's one direction that this all goes, because it is the only way we're going to be able to continue to live on this planet together. So I tend to think that we're going one direction, and that direction is up and forward, up and to the right. So, I think that the community's kind of role in that is, as we've talked about, this is a brand that's built collectively. We don't own it. B Lab, we own it. All the B Corps, the B Corp community. And so I think we'll continue to try to play an enabling and catalytic role to equip people to be able to help us co-create it. And my kind of invitation, and if I see you at Change Now or some B Corp event or wherever it is in the world, and you find me, my question will always be well, how can we do this together? Because I know that B Lab itself trying to do this on its own isn't going to be effective. And that's very clear from the data here. So it's about how can we work together to grow this shared asset in order to achieve a shared vision.
Beautiful. Is there anything that either of you need right now? Because we often ask the listeners, like, how are ways to support? So if you want to throw out what could folks do to support your work?
Wow, amazing. I love that. I mean, they can continue to use the B Corp brand because it's going to help all of us. And they can come with us on this journey to the new standards. I think that this is a time where history is going to reward the brave. And I am more concerned about the actions people take than I am about the talk. And so one of the reasons I remain hopeful in spite of the political environment is I try to skip over the articles about what people are taking out of their 10Ks. And I'm like, I don't love that look. But what I really care about is what are you actually doing within your company? And so I would say, yes, we love it when people help us build the brand. But what we really care about is what's the action you're taking inside your company. And I think coming along with us as we roll out these new ambitious standards that we know is going to be tough and we know it's going to be a big change. The biggest ask I'd have is come with us on that journey.
What about you, Michele? Any requests for listeners to help support the Insights team or your fellowship work?
Ooh. Well, generally, I would agree with Charlotte in that for people to come with us when we're working on next version of our standard, it will make our data job easier the more companies sign on and do all of these similar actions together. And then on the data front,
I mean, Michele, we haven't talked about the fact that a lot of data is out there waiting for people to use it.
True.
Oh, we're talking about data.world?
We are.
Yeah. A quick plug then for data.world, which is a open source data platform that we have that anyone can go into and do some research on B Corps. There is data on all publicly traded B Corps, all the scores of companies over time. So there is a plethora of data for someone to play around with if they ever want to add to the literature that we have on B Corps. Always welcome. We look at them all and try and understand better what is the impact we're having. Well,
Charlotte and Michele, it's been a pleasure. And maybe any sort of upcoming things, Charlotte, that folks should look out for? Is there any in the next 6 months, any publications or anything from your team, or is it all hands on deck on just new standards onboarding?
We have a singular focus on our new standards that all roads lead to the new standards. We are going to be releasing some really awesome short films that we're making in partnership with the BBC, telling the stories of some B Corps in the movement who responded to a public call for stories we did. So another proof point that we do listen when people respond. So there will be some fun storytelling coming out around that.
Awesome. Well, they'll be here soon, folks, if not already when this podcast is released. So thanks again, Charlotte and Michele.
Thanks, Ryan.
Hey, Beyond the Bee listeners. If you're looking for even more inspiring conversations with leaders on the front lines of our movement towards just futures, be sure to subscribe to Next Economy Now, produced by the team at Lift Economy. Next Economy Now broadens the focus beyond the B Corp movement to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, equitable, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Check out our latest episodes at lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can subscribe to Next Economy Now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.